I'll turn that one off.
Thank you very much, Dave, and thank you, ISOC, for the invitation to speak here this morning. As Dave mentioned, CITI, which is the Columbia Institute for Tele-Information, the Columbia Business School, we did this report for the FCC. We updated it after the National Broadband Plan. We updated it in May of 2011. We're going to be updating it again this summer. We have had a lot of eager young interns who are going to be going through piles and piles of data. And our report is simply, it's not original research, it is consolidating lots of other research and trying to provide a reasonably cogent and coherent analysis. What did we say, basically, in the last report? We said by 2013, 2014, the prediction was that providers would be providing availability of low-speed broadband service to about 95% of the homes in America, and 90% of that 90% of the homes would have up to 50 megabits per second, at least advertised speeds. But there was an adoption problem. The forecast was around 69, 70% actual adoption compared to the 95% availability. On the wireless side, 94% of the population covered with a high-speed 4G type service, up to 12 megabits, probably 5 megabits average. But only 53% adoption of wireless broadband, so still plenty of growth on the wireless side. Most homes have a choice of 2 wired broadband services, cable, telco, no surprise. But 5 to 10 million homes in America will have a very inferior choice of broadband, or even no choice. And 5 to 10 million homes, that's up to 9% of the homes in America, will still have a problem with broadband. So we did that survey. Basic conclusion: things were okay, not necessarily fabulous, but a lot of people in the country had broadband and used it. So we did our focus was very much on capital expenditure for broadband, since that's real money being spent for broadband. It kind of tells you where we've been and what's happening in the industry. Well, what we basically noted was that, for some reason, skip it, there we go. Overall capital expenditure in the telecom industry was declining fairly rapidly, but the broadband's portion of CapEx was rising gently. That was, I think, illustrative of the idea that the plain old telephone service was fading away, and not much new investment in plain old telephone service. In fact, almost disinvestment, sort of the milking of the cow, and rather than building the cow. And the broadband was starting to grow with expenditures in $30 to $40 billion a year, which is not insignificant. But we unbundled that a bit and looked at the various sectors, and what you see, of course, is that the wireless investment for broadband is growing quite rapidly. That's illustrative of the build-out of 3G and then 4G networks, and the fact that only around 50-odd% of the people of the United States had a wireless broadband service, and therefore lots of new investment in new cell sites, splitting cell sites, handsets, building a lot of network for what is still a fast-growing business. But with broadband adoption basically plateauing in the high 60s, low 70s percentage, not much real growth in new network construction. So this is obviously on a timer, which might be a clue that I should move along. And just from a frame of reference, UBB, ultra broadband, that's basically what we think of the CITI as basically your gigabit service. But maybe in the near future it's 100 megabits, but in the long run, ultra broadband we think is where the world, where this country will end up inevitably, in plus or minus a gigabit to every home. And what we are also seeing is that so far there's no real investment by the cable industry or the telephone industry to build the ultra broadband networks. So it's basically what we're saying is that without any major capital investment, we're a business as usual situation. What you see in broadband today is what you're going to get, at least for a few years, until those CapEx lines for cable and or telcos start to turn upward fairly dramatically. You're not going to be seeing much ultra broadband. And that's probably reasonable, because for ultra broadband, it's all about video. You don't need gigabits if you're just doing non-video applications. It's the video services that are the big users of hot bandwidth. There's a new television service on the horizon, 4G, 8G TV, Super TV, which will require huge amounts of bandwidth. That may be the trigger for a ubiquitous ultra broadband service to the network, to the consumers. But until you have a lot of video, you don't really need ultra broadband at this stage. Now, there's a big debate about whether wireless services and wired broadband services are competitive or complementary. And in the current world of relatively low-speed broadband, I think it's fair to say wireless services, 4G services, can be substituted for low-speed wired services such as DSL. In fact, what you're seeing is a huge drop-off in DSL. DSL is now negative growth, because people with DSL are either upgrading to a cable service or using a 4G wireless service in lieu of DSL. But beyond, if you're thinking of ultra broadband as 100 megabits to a gigabit, is wireless actually a competitive service, or is it literally a mobile service in the ultra broadband world? My personal guess is wireless is a complementary service in ultra broadband and not competitive, simply because of the bandwidth requirements and the always-on nature of video, particularly if it's being used for basic entertainment video. So I think we're at in a sense, beginning to see a fork in the road of the business. You have basic low-speed broadband, pretty ubiquitous already today, ubiquitous for the future, but the beginnings of a takeoff, and I think the Google Fiber, for example, is an interesting precursor of where the ultra broadband is going to start to take off in the next, let's say, within the next 5 years. And at that point, what do you have, competition, or do you have something else for ultra broadband? And I think part of the question is ultra broadband going to be competitive, regulated, a monopoly, or something else? I almost did a Marco Rubio there. And the answer, of course, is it'll be all those things. Because the big question for ultra broadband, the next generation of high speed, is, well, this graph didn't transmit it. Too bad. What it shows is, didn't print out here. What it shows is a graph of density and density, let's call it density on the vertical axis, and the number of networks on the horizontal axis, and in the lower right-hand corner, where there's density and low of population, you could have multiple networks, and where you have in the upper right-hand corner, where you have very low density, you have zero or no networks. And it's not a very original concept. The fact is, networks and the viability, economic viability of telecom networks are related quite closely to obviously the cost of building it, and a big part of the cost of building it is population density, or the economic viability is population density. And so the question, of course, is, in some markets like Manhattan, New York, very dense, very rich, you could expect multiple networks. You can, in fact, have them. In other parts of the country, we know that there are parts of this country that have no broadband networks today, because they are very low density, in difficult geographic areas, mountains, etc. And so you don't get the economic viability. And is there a business case for multiple ultra broadband networks? It depends. There is no single answer. It will depend on each market. How much demand will there be? Right now, there's really no demand for ultra broadband. Google's playing around with it, a number of municipal networks playing around with it. No obvious demand for gigabit service, but I absolutely believe that eventually everybody will expect and have a 1 gigabit service in the way that they today expect at least a 5 or 10 gigabit service. But how much that is the revenue goes to the network operator versus the content, who knows? Density and market topography, critical. Easy to build network on Long Island, New York, where it's sandy soil, versus Rocky Mountains, where it's just terrible topography. Is it an incremental upgrade? The strength of the cable TV industry is that it only really costs a cable company about $100 to put a new broadband subscriber on an existing cable TV network. So it's a very low cost, which is why cable TV is doing very, very well in the broadband business. It doesn't cost too much to provide broadband service on an incremental basis. Google is going greenfield and is spending, 18 millions and millions of dollars to build a network, 84 million, I think it is, in Kansas City on a greenfield basis, and no obvious business case yet for that investment. We'll see. And then competition. How do you divide up that demand and the revenues that go with it? And is there going to be a big driver for customers to sign up for this ultra broadband service? So this is a business case that has to be done for each market, and different circumstances. You all know Manhattan, New York, rich and dense, as I mentioned. There's Manhattan, Nevada, in the middle of nowhere. And literally, it's got half the per capita income of Manhattan, New York, almost one person per square mile instead of 69 or 67,000 people per square mile. The result of those different circumstances is they have very different telecom attributes. You don't even have cell phone service in Manhattan, Nevada, although most of the residents have a cell phone, because Manhattan, Nevada is in the bottom of a box canyon. The road leads out of town to a highway, and the nearest Walmart is 40 miles away. The nearest grocery store is 20 miles away. And so they have cell phones for when they're on the road, because it's good cell phone coverage on the highway, down at the end of the box canyon. But it's a very different situation. And the very idea that the same regulatory policy is going to work very well in Manhattan, Nevada, and in Manhattan, New York at the same time is laughable, because the circumstances are so different. You don't even, if you have no broadband in Manhattan, Nevada, then you have just a totally different situation than Manhattan, New York, where you've got real competition. And so you just, between the Manhattan, Nevada, and Manhattan, New York, you can probably plot every community in America in terms of the amount of competition, the possibility of competition, and how to regulate in those markets is I think, going to be the real challenge. Because circumstances are going to be so dramatically different in those two markets that you can't have the same policy being optimal in both markets. The internet is a pretty dynamic business. The telecom network is maybe less dynamic, but it's still under development, particularly the ultra broadband. So I look at the situation, it is stupid, frankly, to try to regulate a dynamic, still infant industry with some national static law and regulation, so that a rule that applies and makes a lot of sense for Manhattan, New York, i.e., little or no regulation, that same rule or regulation is the optimal rule regulation for Manhattan, Nevada. I just don't see it. I just can't imagine optimal outcomes. My personal view is that the better solution is to actually regulate or not regulate based on the circumstances of the time, of the moment in each market. So if you've got a lot of competition, you don't have to regulate. If you have no competition, fact, if you have no network, government's going to have to get in it, maybe get in there and build the network, or create a regulatory framework so at least one provider will provide broadband in the market. And between those Manhattan, Nevada, Manhattan, New York endpoints of sequence, different circumstances will apply. It's a challenge for regulation and for law to be dynamically adapted. And that's the challenge for policymakers, to figure out a system of regulation that is dynamically adapted to the specific circumstances. If we could do that, then you could have an optimal solution for every market in America, rather than trying to have one size fits all, which just doesn't work, or it certainly won't be optimal. So, my conclusion.
It's time.
There's my conclusion. We need circumstantial regulation rather than static regulation, and change the regulation as circumstances change.